The night my life fell apart started the same way most nights did, quietly, unremarkably, with me curled up on my couch grading papers I'd been putting off all week. My name is Renee Calloway, and at 26, I had finally carefully built something that resembled a real life. A studio apartment in the better part of town. A teaching assistant position at Westfield Community College. A clean record. A reputation. 3 years of distance from a family that had always treated those things like inconveniences rather than achievements. My phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I almost didn't answer. The screen said MOM, and that alone was enough reason to let it ring. But something, instinct, guilt, the particular brand of obligation that never quite leaves you no matter how far you run, made me pick up. Renee. Her voice was controlled, not panicked. That was the first thing I noticed. My mother, Gloria Calloway, was never panicked. She was calculated. There's a difference, and learning to recognize it had taken me most of my childhood. We have a situation. Your brother needs you. Derek. Of course it was Derek. Derek Calloway was 23, the baby of the family, the one who had never been told no so many times in a row that the word lost its meaning. He was handsome in the way people called charming, when they were being generous, and reckless, when they were being honest. He'd been arrested twice before, once for possession, once for a bar fight that somehow got reduced to disorderly conduct. And both times our parents had smoothed it over with money, connections, and the kind of selective amnesia that wealthy families weaponize. What did he do? I asked. There was a pause. The kind of pause my mother used strategically, the kind that arrived right before she repackaged something catastrophic as something manageable. He was in an accident. He's fine. The other driver is also fine. But Derek was behind the wheel, and his blood alcohol was nearly twice the legal limit. The police have him at Westfield County tonight. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds before adding, and your father has already spoken to Judge Hartley. I sat up straighter. Judge Hartley. Our father's college roommate. A man who had quietly made problems disappear before, and whose name being spoken this late on a Thursday night told me exactly how serious this was. I still don't understand what this has to do with me, I said, though a cold feeling was already spreading through my chest, because I was starting to understand perfectly. My mother's voice dropped half a register, the way it always did when she was about to say something she'd already fully decided. Derek cannot have another mark on his record. He starts at Hargrove Financial in 6 weeks. A DUI will end that before it begins. Your record is clean, Renee. And you, well, you're just a teaching assistant. The cold feeling reached my stomach. She kept going smoothly, efficiently, as if she'd rehearsed it. The officer on scene didn't see who was driving. Derek told them he was the passenger. All you have to do is say you were driving. We'll hire you the best attorney. You'll get a fine, maybe probation, nothing permanent. Your father will make sure of it. And Derek's future stays intact. The apartment felt very small suddenly. I looked at the stack of ungraded papers on my coffee table, at the mug of tea gone cold, at the ordinary Thursday night life I had spent 3 years constructing from scratch. And I realized my mother had just asked me to set it all on fire. What happened next, what I said in that next 30 seconds, is the thing I have replayed 10,000 times since. Because the answer I gave my mother that night was the first domino. And once it fell, nothing would ever be the same again. I said yes. I need you to understand something about that, because it's easy to hear it and think I was weak, or stupid, or that I didn't know better. I knew better. I had always known better. But knowing better and being able to act on it when you're standing inside a family like mine are 2 completely different skills, and I had only ever been taught one of them. The Calloway family operated on a very specific economy. It wasn't money, though there was plenty of that. It was sacrifice, specifically mine. From the time I was 9 years old and Derek was 6, I had been the one who absorbed consequences so that he didn't have to. I took the blame when the window got broken. I claimed the speeding ticket that appeared on the car he'd borrowed without permission when he was 17. I even sat through my grandmother's last birthday dinner pretending I had forgotten to mail her gift, when the truth was Derek had taken the money my parents gave me to buy it and spent it on something I was too old to remember and too tired to care about anymore. The pattern was so old and so deep it had stopped feeling like injustice and started feeling like weather. My father, Raymond Calloway, was at the police station when I arrived at 1 a.m. He was wearing his good coat, the charcoal one he put on when he needed to look like someone whose calls got returned. He looked at me the way he always looked at me when I was useful, with something adjacent to warmth, but not quite warm enough to be love. "Good girl," he said and patted my shoulder once. Derek was in the holding area. When they brought him out, he looked disheveled and slightly embarrassed, but mostly fine. The way someone looks after a bad night rather than after a life-altering mistake. He met my eyes for a fraction of a second, and then looked away, which told me everything about how he felt about what was being done in his name. The officer who processed the paperwork was a young guy, mid-20s, with the kind of tired face that comes from working third shift in a county where money talks. My father had already spoken to someone above him. The paperwork was adjusted. I gave my statement. My voice was steady the entire time, which surprised me, because inside I felt like I was standing at the bottom of a very deep hole watching the opening get smaller above me. I drove home at 3 a.m. and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for a long time. The street was empty. The air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. I kept thinking I would feel something definitive, rage or grief, or at minimum the clean burn of indignation. Instead, I felt something much worse. I felt used to it. What I didn't know, sitting in that car, was that the young officer with the tired face had not been as cooperative as my father believed. He had done something before the paperwork was adjusted, something small and automatic, almost procedural. Something that would sit quietly in a file for 43 days before it detonated my entire family's carefully constructed story. He had submitted the dashcam footage to the county evidence system. All of it. The attorney my parents hired for me was named Gerald Foss, and he was the kind of lawyer whose office smelled like old money and careful conversations. He wore cufflinks. He called me young lady once and then, after reading my expression, never did it again. He told me the case was straightforward. I would plead guilty to a first offense DUI, pay a fine of approximately $4,000, receive 18 months of probation, and surrender my license for 90 days. No jail time. The judge, his old friend, my father's old friend, would ensure the sentence stayed at the lower end of the guidelines. In and out. Clean. Done. And my job? I asked. Gerald Foss shifted in his chair. Teaching assistant positions at community colleges are generally not subject to mandatory reporting requirements for a first offense DUI. You should be fine, he said, should the way people say it when they mean probably, and hope you don't notice the gap. I noticed. I went home and called my department chair anyway, because I believed then that getting ahead of it was always better than being surprised. Professor Aldridge was a 58-year-old woman who had hired me specifically because she said I had good judgment. The silence that followed my explanation of the situation was the longest 7 seconds of my professional life. She didn't fire me that day. She told me to take some time, that the department would need to discuss the matter with the college administration, that I should expect to hear from HR within the week. What she didn't say, but what I could hear underneath every carefully neutral word, was that this was going to cost me something. Maybe everything. I called my mother afterward and told her what Aldridge had said. My mother's response was, "Well, you weren't going to teach there forever anyway." As if my career were a phase. As if the thing I had spent 4 years building in grad school and 3 years more cultivating into something real was just a waiting room I'd been sitting in until I found something better to do. I hung up on her. That was new. Small and probably 3 years overdue, but new. The days between the arrest and the arraignment were a particular kind of awful. The kind where nothing has officially broken yet, but you can hear the cracking. My coworkers were careful around me in the way people are careful around someone who has a terminal diagnosis. My students, who were mostly my age or older and very good at reading rooms, started calling me Ms. Calloway, with a formality they'd never used before, as if they sensed I needed the dignity of the title even as everything else was eroding. I started sleeping badly. I started waking at 4 a.m. and lying in the dark cataloging everything I stood to lose against everything Derek stood to gain, and the math never came out even. It was always the same lopsided equation it had always been, just bigger now. More expensive. More permanent. And then, 31 days after the arrest, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, professional and precise. "Ms. Calloway? My name is Detective Anita Brown. I'm calling regarding the incident on Route 9 on the night of March 14th. I'd like you to come in and speak with me. At your earliest convenience." A pause. Then, carefully. "I'd recommend making it soon." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone after she hung up and felt the specific dread of someone who has been quietly walking toward a cliff edge in the dark and has just heard the sound of open air beneath their next footstep. I called Gerald Foss before I called my parents. That was intentional. I wanted 5 minutes of honest information before the family spin machine started turning, and Gerald, whatever his limitations, was at least obligated to be straight with me when it mattered. He went quiet when I told him about Detective Brown. A different kind of quiet than a pause. A considering kind, the kind that had bad news waiting on the other side. "Don't say anything to anyone," he said. "I'll make some calls. I'll get back to you tonight." He got back to me in 4 hours. He said the words carefully, like someone laying down fragile objects. It appears that dashcam footage from Officer Dimas's vehicle was submitted to the county evidence system on the night of the incident. The footage has been flagged in connection with your case. The DA's office has reviewed it. The room felt like it tilted 2 degrees. "What's on it?" I asked, though I already knew. The answer was Derek. Derek behind the wheel. Derek getting out of the driver's side door. My father arriving and having a 15-minute conversation with the officer before any statements were taken. The whole clean story my family had constructed, sitting in a file, narrated by a camera that had no reason to lie. "Gerald," I said slowly, "am I being investigated for filing a false police report?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. I hung up and sat very still for a long time. The thing about being the one in a family who always absorbs consequences is that you develop a very specific relationship with the moment you realize a consequence has gotten too large to absorb. You've been bracing for it so long from so many smaller directions that when it finally arrives in its full size, part of you almost feels relief. And part of you feels something close to fury. I met with Detective Brown 2 days later. She was a trim woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a manner that was professionally warm in a way that made you understand exactly how good she was at her job. She didn't come at me with accusations. She asked me to walk her through the night of March 14th in my own words. She asked it gently, with a yellow legal pad and a cup of terrible coffee she'd brought for me without being asked. I told the truth. All of it. My mother's phone call. My father's coat. Derek's face when they brought him out, and he looked at me and then looked away. Gerald Foss and his cufflinks and his words should. Professor Aldridge's 7-second silence. All of it in the flat, exhausted voice of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally found a place to set it down. Detective Brown wrote on her legal pad and didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she looked at me over her reading glasses for a long moment. "Ms. Calloway," she said, "I want you to understand that cooperating fully and truthfully at this stage is the most important thing you can do for yourself right now. What happened on March 14th wasn't your decision alone. The court understands that." She slid a piece of paper across the table. I looked at it. Then I looked back at her. Because what was written on that paper changed the entire shape of what was about to happen. Not just to me, but to every Calloway who had ever stood in that parking lot and decided I was the one who could afford to take the fall. My parents didn't know I was in that room. And they definitely didn't know what I had just agreed to do. If you're still watching right now, you're exactly the kind of viewer I love. Subscribe so I can keep giving you stories that touch your heart. Hit that bell, so you never miss what happens next. My mother called me 17 times the day after my meeting with Detective Brown. I answered on the 18th. By then I had already spoken with a new attorney, one I found myself, one who specialized in coercion cases, and whose fees I was paying with the savings account I'd been building for 3 years that my parents didn't know existed. Her name was Patricia Owens. She had short natural hair and a reputation for being unpleasant to opposing counsel, which was exactly what I needed. "Where have you been?" My mother's voice had moved past controlled and into sharp. "Gerald says you've been unreachable. He says you met with a detective without him present." "Renee, what did you do?" I took a breath. I told them the truth, Mom. The silence was volcanic. "You what?" It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a woman recalculating every variable in a plan she thought was airtight. "I told them Derek was driving. I told them about your call. I told them about Dad's conversation with the officer. I told them all of it." My voice was steadier than I expected. Patricia Owens had told me I might feel this way. That truth, once you stop managing it, has a kind of momentum. She was right. My mother said very quietly, "You have no idea what you've just done to this family." "I know exactly what I've done," I said. "The question is why it took me this long." She hung up. 8 minutes later my father called. Raymond Calloway's voice had a specific quality when he was angry that most people never heard, because most people never pushed him far enough to find it. It was low and completely still like deep water. He said my name once, just once, and then said, "Fix this." "I can't fix it, Dad. It's on dashcam." Another silence. Then, "There are ways." "No," I said. And I hung up on my father for the first time in my entire life. I sat with that for a minute. It felt like stepping off a ledge, and discovering the ground was much closer than you'd been told. Derek called that night. He didn't try the controlled approach or the Stillwater voice. He just said, "Renee, come on. Come on, this is my job. This is my whole career." His voice cracked in a way that was genuine, and for a moment I felt it. The old pull, the old instinct that had been installed in me before I was old enough to recognize it as installation. The voice that said he needed me, that I was the one who could fix it, that this was what sisters were for. But then I thought about the way he'd looked at me when they brought him out of holding. The fraction of a second of eye contact before he looked away. He knew, in that moment, what was being done in his name. And he'd looked away anyway. "Derek," I said gently, "you were drunk behind the wheel. You could have killed someone. That's not my problem to carry anymore." I heard him breathing. Then he said something I didn't expect. Something that landed differently than anything else in the whole conversation. Something that made me grip the phone tighter and stare at the wall. He said, "Renee, there's something about that night that you don't know. Something about why I was driving that Dad didn't tell you." I waited. The apartment was very quiet. "Ask Dad," Derek said, "why he was already in that part of town at midnight. Ask him what he was doing on Route 9 before I called him." And then he hung up, and I stood there holding a phone full of a question I didn't know how to begin answering. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my back in the dark, staring at the ceiling, running Derek's words over and over. Ask Dad why he was already in that part of town at midnight. It was such a specific thing to say. Not "there's more to this story," or "you don't have the whole picture." No, it was a geographic detail. Route 9. Midnight. Already there. My father had arrived at the scene of Derek's accident within 12 minutes of Derek's call. I had assumed, everyone had assumed, or at least nobody had questioned, that he'd driven from home. But home was in Millhaven, 28 minutes from that stretch of Route 9 under good conditions. 12 minutes made no sense unless he was already close. I called Patricia Owens at 8 a.m. I told her what Derek had said. She was quiet in that focused way she had, the way that meant she was already several steps ahead and deciding how to share them. "I've been pulling public records as part of your case preparation," she said finally. "Your father's name appears in the visitor log of a property on Route 9, a private address, on multiple occasions in the past year. The most recent entry is dated the night of March 14th. The room went sideways slowly like a ship taking on water." "Whose property?" I asked. Patricia paused in a way that meant the answer was significant. "A woman named Colette Marsh. She's 41. She works in commercial real estate. And she has been corresponding with your father through a secondary email account for approximately 2 years. My father was having an affair. Had been having one, apparently, while I was standing in police stations and risking my career and losing sleep and rebuilding a family relationship I didn't even want to rebuild, purely because that family told me it needed me. He had been at his girlfriend's house on Route 9 when Derek called him from the side of the road. I spent an hour sitting with that. Not because it shocked me, my parents' marriage had always had a specific coldness to it that I'd mistaken for composure, but because of what it meant. My father hadn't just asked me to cover for Derek because my record was clean. He'd orchestrated the cover-up from the scene of his own secret, and he'd kept that secret underneath the one he was asking me to carry. I had been insulating him from 2 directions at once without knowing it. I called Derek back. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "You found out," he said. "How long have you known?" "Almost a year," Derek said. "I saw them at a restaurant in Cedarbrook last spring. Dad saw me see them. He never said anything directly, but a month later he paid off my credit card debt without me asking. Without any conditions." A pause. "I'm not proud of what that means." "It means he was buying your silence," I said. "Yeah." Another pause, this one heavier. "Renee, I didn't want you to take the fall for the DUI. I want you to know that. I told Mom I didn't want that. She said it was already arranged." His voice had that cracked quality again, and this time it was less about the career and more about something else. "I've been letting them do this to you our whole lives, and I never stopped it. That's on me. I didn't say it was okay. Because it wasn't, and he needed to know that. But something in his voice told me he was finally, at 23, beginning to understand the economy he'd been the beneficiary of his entire life. It was a start. What neither of us knew yet was that Detective Brown had not been the only one pulling threads. The DA's office had been building something considerably larger than a DUI cover-up case. And what they had assembled was about to walk into a courtroom and change every single thing. The Westfield County courthouse smelled like old carpet and fluorescent lighting. I sat in the gallery with Patricia Owens on my left, and a legal pad covered in her handwriting on the table between us. My parents arrived 11 minutes after I did. My mother wore her black wool coat, and her expression that she used for funerals and other occasions that required managed grief. My father wore the charcoal coat. He did not look at me when he sat down. Derek sat at the defendant's table beside Gerald Foss, because the case had been refiled correctly, against Derek Calloway, not me. Gerald had aged visibly in the 5 weeks since I'd last seen him. His cufflinks were the same, but his posture was different. The posture of a man who had learned that the smooth path he'd promised his client ran directly through a minefield. The DA was a woman named Helen Garza who wore small wire-framed glasses and spoke in complete, perfectly constructed sentences. She laid out the charges against Derek with the clinical efficiency of someone who had done this many times and found the clarity of facts more persuasive than any flourish. DUI. Property damage. And then she added, without raising her voice at all, additionally, the state intends to present evidence of a coordinated effort to obstruct justice in connection with the original filing of this case. The word coordinated landed like a stone in still water. I watched the ripples find my father's face from across the room. Patricia leaned close and whispered, "That's broader than a DUI filing." They went up the chain. Judge Miriam Wells was 62, with white-streaked hair and a manner that was neither warm nor cold, but rather profoundly, almost architecturally fair. She had been assigned specifically because Judge Hartley, my father's friend, had recused himself under circumstances that had not been made fully public, but that Patricia Owens had described to me as not voluntary. Judge Wells looked at the courtroom over her reading glasses with the gaze of someone who had heard every variation of every story and was interested only in what the evidence actually said. The defense requested a continuance. Standard practice, Patricia had explained. A way to buy time to assess the new landscape. Judge Wells granted it, 30 days, and set the evidentiary hearing for the last Thursday of the following month. On the way out of the courthouse, my mother caught my arm in the lobby. Her grip was controlled like everything she did. She said very quietly close to my ear, "You have destroyed this family." I looked at her for a long moment. Her face was composed, but underneath the composition something was finally, visibly breaking. Not with remorse, but with the specific grief of someone watching power slip away. She had built her life around managing consequences, distributing them where they'd caused the least disruption to the people she'd chosen to protect. She had never once asked herself what that distribution was doing to the person receiving it. "I didn't destroy it, Mom," I said. "I just stopped rebuilding it every time it fell apart." I walked out into the thin November light. Patricia was beside me, already on her phone, and I was thinking about the evidentiary hearing and about what Helen Garza had said, coordinated effort, and about the piece of information Patricia had shared with me in the car that morning, the piece I hadn't yet told anyone, the piece that changed what this hearing was about to become. Because buried in the discovery documents Patricia had received 3 days earlier was something none of us had known existed. Something that was going to make the dashcam footage look like a footnote. 31 days. That's how long it took for the evidentiary hearing to arrive, and I spent every one of them preparing with Patricia Owens in a way I had never prepared for anything in my life. We sat at her conference table for hours at a stretch. We read documents. We reviewed timelines. We built the clearest, most methodical version of the truth we could construct, and we built it for an audience of one, Judge Miriam Wells. The thing buried in the discovery documents was this. Officer Carlos Dimas, the young officer with the tired face who had been on scene that night, had worn a body camera in addition to the dashcam in his vehicle. Standard procedure for the county, implemented 18 months prior. My father's attorney, in the rush to have the original paperwork adjusted, had focused entirely on the squad car footage. The footage that captured the approach to the scene, the vehicle positions, the moment Derek stepped out from the driver's side door. Nobody had thought about what the body camera captured afterward. On foot. Up close. Patricia obtained it through Discovery. We watched it together in her office on a Tuesday evening with the blinds down and the door closed. The footage was 43 minutes long. In the first 9 minutes, you could see my father's charcoal coat, his hands, the practiced casualness of a man who believed he was managing a situation. You could hear his voice, low and steady, speaking to Officer Dimas. You couldn't hear everything, but you could hear enough. Enough to understand the shape of the conversation. Enough to hear my father use the name Hartley. Enough to hear Officer Dimas say, in a voice that carried the exhausted quality of someone who knows they're standing at a line, "Sir, I've already submitted the dashcam to the system. That's automatic. I can't undo that." Enough to hear my father say, "I'm not asking you to undo it. I'm asking you to support the statement the young woman is going to give." Patricia stopped the footage there and looked at me. I looked back at her. The room was very quiet. "That's witness tampering," I said. "At minimum," she said. My father, Raymond Calloway, had not simply accepted a cover story offered by his family. He had actively constructed the terms of the conspiracy at the scene, in front of a camera, while wearing his good coat, in the middle of the night outside his girlfriend's house. He had done it with the absolute confidence of a man who had never once suffered a consequence he hadn't chosen to accept, and who therefore could not fully imagine what it looked like when consequences arrived uninvited. I thought about calling Derek. I thought about calling my mother. I thought about what it would mean for each of them, the different angles of damage, the various ways this information would land differently on people who had played different roles in the same story. Then I thought about my 9-year-old self taking the blame for the broken window. About sitting through my grandmother's birthday dinner. About 1 a.m. in a police station, my voice steady, my record being traded for my brother's 6-figure salary. I didn't call anyone. I went home and I slept better than I had in months. The morning of the evidentiary hearing, Patricia and I arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early. We sat in the hall outside the courtroom, and she reviewed the order of proceedings with me one final time. Helen Garza would present the dashcam footage first, then the body camera footage. Then she would call me to testify about the phone call, the arrangement, the night at the station. Then Patricia would address the circumstances of coercion and my cooperation with the investigation, and make the case that my culpability in the false filing was conditional and that the primary responsibility lay elsewhere. "Are you ready?" Patricia asked. I looked at the courthouse hallway, the old carpet, the fluorescent lights, the steady stream of people moving through their own versions of terrible days. I thought about the word ready and what it actually meant in a moment like this. Not fearless, not certain, just present, willing to be here in this with the truth. "Yes," I said. And then the courtroom doors opened and my parents walked in, and my father finally looked at me, for the first time since I'd hung up on him, and the expression on his face was something I had never seen there before. It was fear. The courtroom was fuller than I expected for an evidentiary hearing. Word had gotten out, the way it always gets out in county courthouses where everyone knows someone who works in the building. There were 3 rows of gallery observers behind the bar, most of them people I didn't recognize. My mother sat in the second row. Derek sat beside her, in a suit that was slightly too nice for the occasion, as if formality could function as armor. Judge Miriam Wells entered at 9:03 a.m. Everyone rose. She sat. We sat. She reviewed the docket for approximately 90 seconds, then looked at the room with the expression of someone who has read the discovery documents and already has a clear sense of where this is going. Helen Garza rose and addressed the court. She was concise and precise, and her opening took exactly 4 minutes. She established the timeline, the accident, the original filing, the dashcam submission, the discovery of the body camera footage, the refiling of charges, the investigation of obstruction. She spoke without drama or flourish, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own, and she was smart enough to know it. Then she said, "Your Honor, the state would like to present Exhibit A, dashcam footage from Officer Carlos Dimas's vehicle, recorded on the night of March 14th. Judge Wells nodded. The bailiff carried a laptop to the projection screen mounted on the courtroom wall. The footage began to play. The room was absolutely silent. I watched it from where I sat next to Patricia, even though I'd seen it 3 times already. There was something different about watching it here, in this room, with the people who needed to see it arranged in the seats around me. The footage showed Route 9. The angle of the headlights. The silver sedan Derek had been driving, canted at an angle against the guardrail where it had sideswiped it at 23 miles per hour. And then, clear, unhesitating, visible in the overhead footage from the dashcam mounted above the windshield. The driver's side door opened and Derek stepped out. Not the passenger side. The driver's side. The timestamps were in the corner of the screen in white numerals. You could see exactly when the car stopped. You could see exactly when Derek got out. You could see the other driver, a woman who had since submitted her own statement to the DA's office, getting out of her car 40 feet ahead. You could see Derek standing on the roadside and the clear, unmistakable geography of who had been behind what wheel. I heard my mother exhale. I didn't look at her. Helen Garza let the footage finish. Then she said, "Your Honor, the state would now like to present Exhibit B." Judge Wells looked at the screen with the same expression she'd had since she sat down. Not blank, but very, very controlled. She said, "Proceed." The body camera footage began. The first 9 minutes were exactly what Patricia and I had watched in her office. My father's charcoal coat. His hands. His voice. Officer Dimas's voice. And then the words, "Hartley, I can't undo that. I'm not asking you to undo it," support the statement the young woman is going to give. My father, Raymond Calloway, sat at the respondent's table and did not move. He had the stillness of someone who has been standing in a room waiting for the ceiling to fall, and has finally heard the first crack. His attorney had his hand on his arm. I couldn't see my father's expression from where I sat, but I could see the shape of his shoulders, and the shape of his shoulders told me everything. Judge Wells stopped the footage herself, which was not standard. She held up her hand, and the bailiff paused the playback, and she looked at the courtroom with an expression that had finally moved past controlled into something more recognizable as human feeling. Not anger exactly. Something more like the feeling a person gets when they realize the depth of contempt someone has shown for a system they've spent their life trying to make work. She said, "In my 21 years on this bench, I want to be clear that what I have just watched constitutes one of the most deliberate and premeditated obstructions of justice I have personally encountered at this level of court. This was not a panicked decision. It was not a moment of poor judgment. It was a coordinated effort, conducted methodically, by individuals who believed their access to this court's relationships made them immune to its consequences." She looked directly at the respondent's table. They were wrong. I realized I was holding my breath. I let it go. Patricia put her hand briefly on my arm. And then Judge Wells said the words that I had not let myself fully believe would ever come. Because letting yourself believe the thing you most need to be true before it's true is a risk I had learned too early not to take. The charges against Renee Calloway in the original filing are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Ms. Calloway's cooperation with this investigation will be formally noted for the record. The charges against Derek Calloway will proceed as filed. And I am referring the matter of Raymond Calloway's conduct on the night of March 14th to the District Attorney's Office for further review under witness tampering statutes. The room made a sound. Not loud. Just the collective exhale of people watching something arrive at its correct destination after a long, wrong detour. I looked at my hands. I looked at Patricia, who was writing on her legal pad with the focused calm of someone who had believed this outcome was possible and had worked toward it with precision. I looked at the courtroom wall where the paused footage still glowed on the screen. My father's coat, the road, the clear evidence of everything that had been done and denied. And then I let myself look at my family for the first time since the footage ended. Derek had his face in his hands. My mother sat perfectly still composed, but her composure had changed quality. It was no longer control, it was just stillness, the stillness of something after the kinetic energy has finally run out. My father stared straight ahead at nothing. For the first time in my life, the Calloway family's economy of sacrifice had rendered a bill that landed at the right address. People ask me what I felt when I walked out of that courthouse. They expect something large, catharsis, triumph, the clean, bright feeling of justice as it's depicted in movies where the music swells and the camera pulls back and everyone you love looks at you with new eyes. The truth is smaller and more complicated, and I think more honest. I felt tired. Genuinely, deeply tired. The way you feel when you've been tensed against something for so long that relaxing it actually hurts. I stood on the courthouse steps in the November cold with Patricia beside me, and I breathed in cold air, and for a long moment that was enough. My father retained a criminal defense attorney that same afternoon. Gerald Foss, notably, was not available. Patricia told me the witness tampering review would take several months to resolve. These things move slowly in county courts, but that the dashcam and body camera footage made the evidence landscape very difficult for the defense. Difficult was Patricia's word for what most people would call impossible. But she was too good a lawyer to use a word she couldn't guarantee. Derek pled guilty to the DUI 6 weeks after the hearing. He received a fine, 90 days of license suspension, mandatory alcohol counseling, and 18 months of probation. Hargrove Financial rescinded his offer, as he'd known they would. He moved back into my parents' house for a while, which I understood was its own particular punishment, though he never said so out loud. He called me on the day his plea was entered. I answered. He didn't apologize the way people apologize when they want absolution, the long, elaborate kind that's really about making themselves feel better. He just said, "I'm going to spend a long time making this right. I don't expect you to believe that yet." And then he said, "I also want you to know, and this doesn't make anything okay, that I talked to Patricia's office last month and gave them the written record of everything I knew about Dad's arrangement with Officer Dimas. Everything I had." A pause. I probably should have done it sooner. He should have. But I'd spent enough of my life measuring people against what they should have done sooner. It's a calculation that never ends and never satisfies. I told him I heard him. That was honest. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a door left open, and after everything, that felt like more than enough to start with. Professor Aldridge called me the week after the hearing. She said the department had reviewed the situation in light of the dismissed charges and the circumstances on record, and had reinstated my TA position, pending a formal HR sign-off that was expected to be routine. She said it with a warmth in her voice that I hadn't heard since before all of this started. When I thanked her, she said, "Renee, your record is clean. That's what matters. And your students have been asking about you." My students. I thought about them. The Tuesday and Thursday morning section, mostly adult learners, people who'd come back to education after years of working and raising families, people who understood viscerally that circumstances could reshape your trajectory without reflecting your character. I thought about what I would say to them when I got back in that classroom. Probably nothing. Probably just, "Good morning, open to chapter 6, let's pick up where we left off." Sometimes that's the best and truest thing you can say. Here we are. Let's keep going. My mother and I have not spoken since the hearing. I've thought about what I would want a conversation with her to look like, and I keep arriving at the same answer. I'm not sure one is possible yet. She was not charged with anything legally. What she did exists in a space the law doesn't fully reach. The space of a mother who chose one child so completely that she was willing to feed the other to her own family's machine. I can describe that clearly. I can feel the full weight of it. What I can't do, at least not yet, is know what to do with it. So I'm leaving it where it is for now, setting it in a corner like a piece of furniture I'll deal with when I have more room. What I know is this. I am back in my apartment. I am back in my classroom. I am still a teaching assistant at Northfield Community College, still grading papers on Thursday nights, still drinking tea that goes cold. My life is not dramatically different from the outside. But inside it, in the way it sits in my body, in the way I move through it, something has changed completely. I stopped being the daughter who absorbs consequences for other people. Not because I stopped loving my family. That would be easier to explain, but it wouldn't be true. I stopped because I finally understood that absorbing other people's consequences is not love. It looks like love, especially when you've been taught to perform it since childhood. But it isn't. Love doesn't ask you to disappear into it. Love doesn't hand you someone else's damage and call it family loyalty, and then look away while you carry it. The dashcam showed the truth. The body camera showed the truth. And I, in a detective's office on a Tuesday afternoon, in a voice steadier than I expected, with 31 days of sleeplessness behind me and a life I wasn't ready to lose in front of me, I chose the truth too. That's the thing about the Zeigarnik effect, the thing my students and I actually discussed once in the context of narrative structure. We are wired to need resolution. Open loops create discomfort. We stay for the answer. We stay because something is unfinished and the incompleteness pulls at us, demands to be closed. For 26 years, the open loop in my life was whether the Calloway family would ever see me clearly, whether the scales would ever balance, whether the version of myself I'd built outside their reach, carefully, expensively, alone, would ever be recognized as the real one. The judge pressed play. The loop closed. I walked out into the November light, and it was mine.